I think that we should talk about space, because space is, after all, the most important part of life. Without space, we cannot exist, and without space, nature cannot be what it is. And without space, design and art and architecture and all the aesthetic disciplines cannot be what they are. And the quality of the aesthetic disciplines, whatever the aesthetic discipline may be, whether it is painting or drawing or even a stage production or architecture or any art form, because any art form has a very basic relationship to space. So when I say that we should talk about space, I mean that we should develop an acute awareness of how we relate to space as something sacred in a way. Because space is sacred, because everything that exists in space, and we should also say everything that exists because of space. And the quality of architecture, for instance, or the quality of design, or the quality of any kind of artwork depends on the sensitivity that we have to space itself. So this has to do, of course, with composition, and with composition as a discipline in itself. Because composition is a discipline in itself. Never mind the content of the artwork, space itself is always a discipline in itself. I mean, composition is always a discipline in itself. And of course, composition relies always on space and relates directly to how we handle space. So, okay, let's say that the value of space is a sacred value. Space is the highest value, we could say, because everything that exists in space. Without space, we cannot do anything in the right way. So, what is the thing that we really should think about when it comes to space in art? Let's talk directly about that which we could call empty space. Empty space is, of course, never empty. We know that, of course, in science, we know that empty space is never empty. There might be a completely empty space, but that space is the primary space that gives space to anything else that occurs in space. So, but for us, for the human eye, for the human perception, or for the human program, we could say, space is actually never really empty, although we perceive it as empty sometimes. But that which we call empty space is something that we can cultivate in a way that we could say that we can charge empty space. We can charge a space just in the way that we can charge a battery, because we can increase the energy within a certain space through the means of composition. Let's say that empty space is a battery. And the way that we do our compositions with the different objects that we have at hand, whether it is painting or architecture or design or whatever it is, that will decide how this space is charged. If we just draw a line on paper, it may be only a line on paper, but it could also mean that it charges the space on both sides of the line. So if you have two lines on a piece of paper, perhaps the space between the two lines are charged in a way that the space on the outside of the two lines are not charged. Or the space on the right side is charged, but not on the left side. If we can develop an awareness of how to charge the empty space, then we will get a feeling for composition. This is how we develop a sensitivity for composition as a discipline in itself, composition as an art form in itself. And this goes extremely for interior design and for stage design and for architecture, both in a micro perspective or in a macro perspective. And of course, also it goes for painting and any pictorial art form, photography too. So we should do exercises with a piece of paper and pencil or with charcoal and see how we can charge a space. So we're going to talk about manifestation and non-manifestation. Non-manifestation means the empty space that we have at hand, the empty space that we choose to be available in our composition. So we can charge that space by the way that we place the objects or the lines or the phenomenons, the manifestations in our composition, so that there will be a balance between manifestation and non-manifestation. The empty space, which we call non-manifestation, will be charged in a way that we can choose, that we can decide. We can decide how we want to charge that space just by the way that we put the objects together. This is, of course, very Zen, it is very present when it comes to the art form of Zen or design with Zen elements. We cannot have Zen in design without an acute awareness of space itself and how to charge a space, how to relate to space. As designers or artists or architects, we know about manifestation. We know how it is when we put something on a piece of paper. We know what happens when we make a composition in space, as if an interior design. So we know that. We can see it very clearly, what happens to the space itself when we move our objects or the manifestations that we are working with. So we're going to develop an awareness of how we use space and how we appreciate space and how we cultivate an awareness of space as something sacred, as a value in itself. Space is a value in itself. That is perhaps, I guess, the point of this talk. The point of this talk is to see space as a value in itself, that space is something sacrosanct, it is something sacred, it is something that we have to respect. We have to respect the empty space, because empty space is potential. And not only potential, it is also a quality that we cannot pollute, or that we should not pollute or disturb. We should always respect the value of space and of empty space. So this is an introduction to our practice today, which will be about developing an awareness of space as a value in itself, and how we relate to it, and how we treat space in our work in composition. And composition in graphic design, in painting, or in architecture, or in photography, or in interior design. So we're going to develop an awareness of how space should be allowed to speak for itself. We should develop an awareness of how we should give space to space itself. We should develop an awareness of how to protect the intrinsic value of space itself, and learn how we can charge a space through the means of composition. Right. Thank you. So this is the introduction, so to speak, to our workshop or to our practice.